The Jefferson County Courthouse stood tall and imposing on a humid Tuesday morning. People shuffled through the security checkpoint, their faces showing varying degrees of worry. Among them was Letitia Johnson, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher with a spotless record who found herself in court for the first time over a disputed traffic violation. Letitia wore a modest navy blue dress and kept her natural hair neatly styled. She clutched a folder containing her evidence. Photos of the broken traffic light and statements from two witnesses who had seen the same malfunction. She had prepared meticulously for this hearing, convinced that justice would prevail if she presented her case clearly. Docket number 47,329, Johnson v. State, called the court clerk in a monotone voice. Letitia stood and walked confidently to the defendant's table. The courtroom was only half full, but she felt every eye on her as she placed her folder on the table and smoothed her dress. Judge Robert Harmon barely looked up from his papers. At 58, Harmon had served on the bench for over 20 years. His reputation among courthouse staff had grown increasingly troubling over the past few years, but his connections to local politicians had insulated him from any serious consequences. "Ms. Johnson," he drawled, finally looking up at her. "I see you've decided to contest a simple traffic citation. Don't you think the court has more important matters to handle today?" Letitia remained composed. "Your Honor, I believe there has been a mistake. The traffic light was malfunctioning, showing green in all directions. I have evidence." Judge Harmon cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Everyone has evidence that they shouldn't have to pay their tickets, Ms. Johnson." Court reporter Melissa Chen's fingers paused briefly over her stenotype machine. She had noticed a pattern in Judge Harmon's behavior with certain defendants, and her concerns had been growing for months. "Your Honor, I understand, but if you could please just look at these photographs." "You people always have excuses, don't you?" Judge Harmon said, his voice dripping with contempt. Several gasps could be heard around the courtroom. "Next you'll be telling me the system is rigged against you." Letitia blinked, stunned by the judge's words. "Excuse me, Your Honor." "You heard me," Harmon continued, leaning forward. "I'm tired of defendants like you wasting this court's time." Bailiff Officer Marcus Williams shifted uncomfortably at his post. He exchanged a quick glance with Melissa Chen, who supply nodded at him. This wasn't the first time they had witnessed such behavior from Judge Harmon. Letitia stood straight, her dignity intact despite the judge's attempts to humiliate her. "Your Honor, I am a tax-paying citizen with the right to present my case in court. I would appreciate if my evidence could be considered fairly." "Oh, listen to her," Judge Harmon sneered, looking around the courtroom as if seeking approval from an audience. "Using big words and acting like she belongs in my courtroom." Unknown to Judge Harmon, District Attorney Sarah Phillips had quietly entered the back of the courtroom. She had received several complaints about the judge's conduct and had come to observe him firsthand. Her face darkened as she listened to his words. Letitia remained calm despite her racing heart. "Your Honor, is everything you're saying being recorded for the court transcript?" The question seemed to irritate Judge Harmon further. His face reddened as he leaned toward his microphone. "Don't you dare question how I run my courtroom, Ms. Johnson. I've been dealing with people like you for decades." The courtroom fell silent. The tension was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy as all eyes darted between Judge Harmon and Letitia Johnson. The judge's face had turned an angry shade of red, and the vein on his temple pulsed visibly. Letitia took a deep breath, steadying herself against the wave of humiliation washing over her. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, measured voice, "I respectfully ask that you clarify what you mean by people like me." Judge Harmon scoffed loudly. "Don't play dumb with me, Ms. Johnson. You know exactly what I mean." From her position at the stenotype machine, Melissa Chen's fingers moved rapidly, recording every word. She caught Officer Williams's eye again, and he gave her a subtle nod. At the back of the courtroom, District Attorney Sarah Phillips quietly took out her phone and began typing a message. "Actually, Your Honor, I don't know what you mean," Letitia replied, her voice unwavering despite her racing heart. "I'm here as a citizen exercising my legal right to contest a citation I believe was issued in error." Judge Harmon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the courtroom. "Let me guess, you're going to tell me next that you have a master's degree and teach children." Letitia blinked in surprise. Yes, I do have a master's in education. I've been teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary for 8 years. Well, isn't that something? The judge said with exaggerated surprise. He turned to the clerk. Make a note that Ms. Johnson claims to be educated. That's rare for. He caught himself, seeming to suddenly remember the public setting. But Letitia wouldn't let it slide. Rare for what, Your Honor? For black women? Several people in the courtroom gasped. Judge Harmon slammed his gavel down so hard that the sound made everyone jump. You are dangerously close to contempt of court, Ms. Johnson, he shouted. I believe it is you who is showing contempt, Your Honor, Letitia replied, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. Contempt for me, for this legal process, and for the oath you took to uphold justice equally. Judge Harmon's face contorted with rage. That's it, I'm holding you in contempt. Officer Williams, take her into custody. Officer Williams hesitated, looking uncomfortable. From the back of the courtroom, District Attorney Phillips stood up. Excuse me, Your Honor, she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. All heads turned toward her as she walked down the center aisle. District Attorney Phillips, Judge Harmon said, his tone suddenly more controlled. This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to my humble courtroom today? I received some concerning reports about proceedings in this courtroom, Phillips replied coolly. I decided to observe for myself. Well, as you can see, I'm dealing with a difficult and disrespectful defendant, Judge Harmon said, gesturing dismissively toward Letitia. Phillips looked at Letitia, then back at the judge. What I see, Judge Harmon, is a citizen being denied her right to due process and being subjected to what appears to be discriminatory treatment. The judge's face paled slightly. I don't know what you're implying, but... I'm not implying anything, Phillips interrupted. I'm stating what I observed, along with what has been documented by several court employees over the past few months. Melissa Chen looked up from her stenotype machine, her expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. Officer Williams shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand no longer resting on his handcuffs. The courtroom doors opened again, and 2 stern-looking men in suits entered, followed by a woman carrying a briefcase bearing the seal of the Judicial Conduct Commission. Judge Harmon's eyes widened as he recognized them. His gavel slipped from his fingers, landing on the bench with a dull thud. Letitia stood tall, watching as the tables began to turn in a way she never could have imagined when she walked into court that morning. Judge Harmon's face turned from red to ashen as the representatives from the Judicial Conduct Commission approached the bench. The woman with the briefcase, Gloria Richards, had been investigating judicial misconduct for 15 years and had seen it all, but even she seemed taken aback by what she had just witnessed. Your Honor, Richards said, her voice crisp and official, we need to speak with you in your chambers immediately. Judge Harmon's eyes darted around the courtroom like a cornered animal's. We're in the middle of proceedings, he said, attempting to regain his composure. I believe these proceedings should be suspended, District Attorney Phillips interjected. Ms. Johnson, you are free to return to your seat. No contempt charge will be filed against you today. Letitia nodded gratefully and walked back to her seat, feeling dozens of eyes following her. The whispers around the courtroom grew louder as people tried to understand what was happening. Court is in recess for 30 minutes, Judge Harmon announced abruptly, banging his gavel. He stood up quickly, his judicial robes billowing as he rushed toward his chambers. The Judicial Conduct Commission representatives followed closely behind. As soon as the judge left, court reporter Melissa Chen approached District Attorney Phillips, clutching a small USB drive. Ms. Phillips, she said quietly, I have something you need to see. Is that what I think it is? Phillips asked, eyeing the USB. Chen nodded. 6 months of recordings, not just today. Judge Harmon has been saying these things for a long time, especially to black women and Latino defendants. Officer Williams joined them. I can confirm that, he said solemnly. I've witnessed similar behavior at least 20 times in the past year alone. Phillips took the USB drive. Thank you both for your courage. This will make a difference. Across the courtroom, Letitia sat stunned, trying to process everything that had happened. A middle-aged white woman slid into the seat next to her. I'm Barbara Kent from the County Times, she whispered. Would you be willing to talk about what just happened? Before Letitia could answer, another woman approached. Ms. Johnson, I'm Renee Washington, civil rights attorney. I've been building a case against Judge Harmon for months. Your experience today might be the tipping point we needed. Letitia looked between the two women, overwhelmed. I just came here about a traffic ticket, she said, her voice barely audible. Meanwhile, in Judge Harmon's chambers, the confrontation was heating up. Gloria Richards played a recording from her phone, a compilation of Harmon's most offensive comments from previous hearings. Where did you get these? Harmon demanded, his face twisted with anger. Someone's been recording my courtroom illegally. These come from official court records, Your Honor, Richards replied coolly. Court reporter logs, official transcripts, and audio backups that are made as a matter of procedure. This is a setup, Harmon sputtered. Phillips has been gunning for me for years. The door to the chambers opened, and Sheriff Deputy James Rodriguez entered without knocking. Excuse me, he said, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Outside in the hallway, the commotion grew louder. Court staff peered out from doorways, watching as more law enforcement officers arrived. Back in the courtroom, Letitia sat quietly as people buzzed around her. Officer Williams approached her again. Ms. Johnson, I want to apologize for not stepping in sooner, he said, his expression troubled. Many of us knew what was happening, but the judge has powerful friends. Why now? Letitia asked. What changed today? Officer Williams smiled slightly. Look around you. Letitia glanced around the courtroom and noticed something she hadn't before. In the back row sat 3 elderly black women, all dressed formally and taking notes. The courthouse angels, Williams explained. Retired judges and lawyers who have been documenting judicial misconduct for years. They contacted the Judicial Commission last week. Your case was just the final piece of evidence they needed. As if on cue, the doors to the judge's chambers burst open, and Sheriff Rodriguez emerged, followed by Judge Harmon, now without his robes and with his hands behind his back. The courtroom fell silent as everyone realized what they were seeing. Judge Robert Harmon was in handcuffs. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom as Judge Robert Harmon was led out in handcuffs. His face had drained of all color, and the arrogance that had dominated his expression minutes before was replaced by shock and fear. The powerful man who had ruled his courtroom like a personal kingdom now looked small and ordinary without his judicial robes. Sheriff Deputy Rodriguez guided Harmon firmly by the elbow. Robert Harmon, you are under arrest for abuse of judicial authority, violation of civil rights under color of law, and official misconduct, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. This is outrageous, Harmon shouted, struggling against the handcuffs. Do you know who I am? Who my friends are? That's exactly the problem, Your Honor, Rodriguez replied calmly. We all know who you are, and now we know what you've been doing with your power. As they passed the bench where Letitia was sitting, Judge Harmon stopped and glared at her with such hatred that she instinctively leaned back. This is your fault, he hissed. You just couldn't take your ticket like everyone else, could you? Before Letitia could respond, District Attorney Phillips stepped between them. That's enough, Robert. You've said more than enough already. You'll regret this, Sarah, Harmon threatened as Rodriguez urged him forward. Senator Wallace will hear about this. The governor is my golf buddy. Keep walking, sir, Rodriguez said, tightening his grip on Harmon's arm. The courtroom erupted into chaos as soon as Harmon was led out the door. Reporters who had been alerted by courthouse staff rushed in with cameras and microphones. Court clerks huddled together in small groups, whispering frantically. The 3 elderly women that Officer Williams had identified as the courthouse angels nodded at each other with satisfaction. Renee Washington, the civil rights attorney, sat down next to Letitia. Ms. Johnson, what just happened is extraordinary. In my 20 years of practice, I've never seen a judge arrested in his own courtroom. Letitia shook her head in disbelief. I don't understand. All of this because he was rude to me? No, Washington explained gently. What you experienced was the last straw in a long pattern of abuse. The Judicial Conduct Commission had been building a case against him for months. They needed clear evidence of his bias in action, and unfortunately, you provided that today. Melissa Chen approached them, still clutching her stenotype machine's backup drive. Ms. Johnson, I need to apologize to you as well. I've been documenting Judge Harmon's behavior for almost a year, but I was too afraid to come forward until now." "What changed?" Letitia asked. Chen looked down. "Courage is contagious. When you stood up to him instead of cowering like most defendants do, it gave me the strength to finally do something." Officer Williams joined their growing circle. The department has received complaints about Judge Harmon for years, but they were always dismissed. His friendship with the police chief and several state senators made him untouchable, or so we thought. The main doors opened again, and a tall, distinguished black woman in her 60s entered the courtroom. The crowd parted as she walked directly toward Letitia. "Ms. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Judge Evelyn Hargrove from the State Supreme Court. I apologize for what you experienced today." Letitia stood to shake the judge's hand, completely overwhelmed. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I don't understand why you're here." Judge Hargrove smiled kindly. "The Judicial Conduct Commission has been working with our court on a statewide review of judicial misconduct. When we received evidence about Judge Harmon weeks ago, I volunteered to oversee the investigation personally." She turned to address the crowded courtroom. "This court will be temporarily closed while we conduct a full review of all cases presided over by Judge Harmon during the past 5 years. A young man raised his hand hesitantly. "What about our scheduled hearings?" "All cases will be reassigned to other judges," Hargrove explained. "And any defendant who believes they received unfair treatment from Judge Harmon can file for a review of their case." As the reality of what was happening sank in, Letitia realized that her simple traffic ticket had somehow triggered an earthquake in the local justice system. She felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety as reporters began to approach her for comment. "Ms. Johnson," Barbara Kent from the County Times called out, "how does it feel to be the one who finally brought down the infamous Judge Harmon?" Letitia stared at the reporter, feeling suddenly like a deer caught in headlights. The question hung in the air as camera flashes popped around her. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted justice for her traffic ticket. I didn't bring anyone down," she finally managed to say. "I just stood up for myself." District Attorney Phillips stepped in smoothly. "Ms. Johnson is not making any statements at this time. This is an ongoing investigation, and we ask that the press respect her privacy." Judge Hargrove nodded in agreement. "Court proceedings are suspended for today. Everyone with scheduled hearings will be contacted about rescheduling." As the crowd began to disperse, Renee Washington placed a protective arm around Letitia's shoulders. "Let's get you out of here through the side exit. The media circus is just beginning." They moved quickly through a narrow hallway, guided by Officer Williams. He pushed open a service door that led to a small parking area reserved for courthouse employees. "My car is on the other side of the building," Letitia said, glancing nervously at the group of reporters gathering at the main entrance. "I'll drive you," Washington offered. "We need to talk about what happens next anyway." Once they were safely in Washington's car, Letitia finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding all morning. Her hands were shaking. "This is insane," she whispered. "All I wanted was to contest a $120 ticket." Washington smiled sympathetically as she navigated out of the parking lot. "Sometimes small actions trigger big changes. What Judge Harmon did to you today, that was just the visible part of a much larger problem." "But why did they arrest him?" Letitia asked. "Being racist and rude is horrible, but is it illegal?" "It's more complicated than that," Washington explained. "The Judicial Conduct Commission doesn't arrest judges for being rude, but they do investigate judges who systematically violate defendants' civil rights." Washington turned onto a quiet side street and pulled over. From her briefcase, she removed a thick folder and handed it to Letitia. "This contains sworn statements from 27 defendants who appeared before Judge Harmon in the past year. Notice any patterns?" Letitia flipped through the pages. Each statement described similar experiences: Black and Latino defendants being mocked, interrupted, or given harsher sentences than white defendants with similar charges. "There's also financial misconduct," Washington continued. "We have evidence that Judge Harmon dismissed cases for defendants represented by 3 specific law firms, all owned by his former law school classmates." Letitia closed the folder, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. "So what happens now?" "Judge Harmon will be formally charged," Washington said. "The evidence against him is substantial, but there's something else you should know. She pulled out her phone and showed Letitia a local news website. Already, the headline was splashed across the screen. Local teacher stands up to corrupt judge, triggers courthouse arrest. Letitia's photo, taken from her school's website, was prominently displayed. "Oh no," she whispered. "I never wanted this kind of attention." "I understand," Washington said gently. "But like it or not, you've become the face of this case. People will want to hear your story." As if on cue, Letitia's phone buzzed with messages. Her principal, her mother, friends, all asking what was happening and if she was okay. "My students will see this," she said, her voice trembling. "Their parents will see this. What if it affects my job?" "That's why you need representation," Washington replied. "Not just for any potential civil case against Harmon, but to help navigate what's coming. The media attention, the supporters, the critics. It can be overwhelming." Letitia looked out the window, watching as normal life continued on the street outside. People walking dogs, checking mail, living ordinary lives. The kind of life she had before walking into that courtroom this morning. "I'm not an activist," she said quietly. "I'm just a teacher who got an unfair ticket." Washington smiled kindly. Sometimes justice finds its champions in the most unexpected places. The question is, what will you do with this moment now that it's found you? 2 days after Judge Harmon's arrest, Letitia sat in her living room surrounded by stacks of newspapers. Her face appeared on the front page of most of them, usually alongside an unflattering mugshot of Judge Harmon being led away in handcuffs. Her phone had been ringing constantly, and she had finally turned it off. "You need to eat something," her mother, Elaine, said as she placed a sandwich on the coffee table. At 65, Elaine Johnson had seen enough injustice in her lifetime to recognize the importance of what her daughter had started. "I'm not hungry, Mom," Letitia replied, rubbing her tired eyes. She hadn't returned to her classroom since the incident. Her principal had called to offer her paid leave until things settled down. The doorbell rang, making both women jump. Elaine peered through the peephole and then opened the door. Renee Washington entered, followed by a stern-looking woman in a perfectly tailored suit. "Ms. Johnson, this is Special Prosecutor Helena Martinez," Washington said. "She's been appointed by the Attorney General to handle the case against Judge Harmon." Martinez shook Letitia's hand firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know the past few days have been difficult." Letitia gestured for them to sit down. "Have there been any new developments?" Martinez nodded, opening her leather portfolio. "The investigation has expanded significantly. After Judge Harmon's arrest was made public, our office received over 40 new complaints from former defendants. But that's not why I'm here." She pulled out a document and placed it on the coffee table. This was found during the search of Judge Harmon's home office. Letitia leaned forward to look at what appeared to be a handwritten list of names, including hers, with dates and notes beside each one. "What is this?" she asked. "We believe it's a list of individuals Judge Harmon specifically targeted in his courtroom," Martinez explained. "Notice the dates? These go back 3 years. Your name was added just last week when your hearing was scheduled." A chill ran through Letitia. But how would he even know about me before I entered his courtroom? Martinez's expression darkened. "That's where things get more concerning. We've discovered that Judge Harmon had an arrangement with certain police officers. They would flag potential targets for him, mostly educated minorities who might be more likely to challenge their citations. That's why I received such an unfair ticket," Letitia whispered, the pieces suddenly fitting together. "The light was clearly broken that day. The officer must have known I would contest it." "Exactly," Martinez confirmed. "They were feeding people into his courtroom deliberately. We believe Officer Jason Reynolds, who issued your citation, was part of this network." Elaine gasped. "So this wasn't just one corrupt judge?" "I'm afraid not," Martinez said. "We're looking at what appears to be a systematic effort to humiliate and financially burden specific types of citizens. The traffic violations were just the beginning. Once people had marks on their records from Harmon's court, they became targets for additional harassment." Renee Washington placed a supportive hand on Letitia's shoulder. "The good news is that this case has broken open what might be one of the biggest judicial corruption scandals in state history." Letitia shook her head in disbelief. all because I refused to be quiet when he insulted me. Sometimes it takes just one person standing firm to bring down a corrupt system, Martinez said with grudging admiration. But that's also why I'm here. Judge Harmon's preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week, and you're our key witness. She handed Letitia another document. This is your formal subpoena, but I wanted to deliver it personally and prepare you for what's coming. What should I expect? Letitia asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Harmon has hired Gregory Bennett as his defense attorney, one of the most aggressive in the state. They'll try to discredit you, suggest you misunderstood the judge's comments, or claim you provoked him. Elaine made a sound of outrage, but Martinez continued. They'll dig into your past, your social media, anything they can find to paint you as someone with an agenda. Letitia took a deep breath. Let them try. I know what happened, and so does everyone else who was in that courtroom. The determination in her voice surprised even her. Something had changed inside Letitia Johnson. A quiet teacher who had entered that courtroom days ago was finding her voice, and it was stronger than she ever imagined. The Jefferson County Courthouse looked different to Letitia this time, as she climbed the stone steps a week later, flanked by Renee Washington and Special Prosecutor Martinez. She noticed details she had missed before: the worn spots on the marble stairs, the slight tilt of the large bronze scales of justice above the entrance, the expressions of anxiety on the faces of people entering the building. "Ray?" Washington asked quietly as they approached the security checkpoint. Letitia nodded, adjusting the collar of the simple blue blazer she had chosen for today. "As ready as I'll ever be." Unlike her first appearance, this time the main courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists filled the back rows, their notebooks and tablets ready. The courthouse angels, the three elderly women who had helped expose Judge Harmon, sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly as Letitia entered. Court reporter Melissa Chen and Officer Williams were already seated in the witness-waiting area. Both would testify before Letitia. Chen looked nervous, repeatedly checking the USB drive that contained her evidence. "Don't worry," Letitia whispered as she sat beside them. "You did the right thing." Chen smiled gratefully. "So did you." A side door opened, and Judge Harmon entered with his attorney, Gregory Bennett, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for ruthlessness. Harmon had lost weight in the week since his arrest. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes darted around the courtroom, avoiding direct contact with anyone. Judge Patricia Lawson, brought in from a neighboring county to preside over the case, called the court to order. "This is the preliminary hearing in the matter of the state versus Robert Harmon. We will determine today if there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial." Martinez presented the state's case methodically, beginning with testimony from court employees who had documented Harmon's pattern of discriminatory behavior. Officer Williams described what he had witnessed over the years, his voice steady despite Bennett's aggressive cross-examination. When Melissa Chen took the stand, Bennett attempted to portray her as disgruntled and unprofessional. "Isn't it true that Judge Harmon reprimanded you last year for tardiness?" Bennett demanded. "Yes," Chen admitted. "But that has nothing to do with why I documented his behavior." "So you admit you had personal reasons to dislike the judge?" Chen looked directly at Harmon. "I documented his behavior because it was wrong, because people deserve better from their justice system." Then it was Letitia's turn. As she took the oath, she felt strangely calm. Martinez guided her through the events of that morning in Harmon's courtroom, asking her to recount exactly what had happened. "He told me you people always have excuses," Letitia testified. "When I asked what he meant, he became more agitated." Throughout her testimony, Harmon stared at the table in front of him, refusing to meet her eyes. When Bennett stood for cross-examination, his approach was immediate and aggressive. "Ms. Johnson, isn't it true that you were angry about receiving a traffic ticket and came to court that day with a chip on your shoulder?" "No," Letitia replied calmly. "I came to present evidence that the traffic light was malfunctioning." Bennett approached the witness stand. "And when Judge Harmon didn't immediately accept your explanation, you became confrontational, didn't you?" "I remained respectful throughout the hearing," Letitia said. "The court transcript confirms that." Bennett changed tactics. "Have you ever posted on social media about racial issues, Ms. Johnson?" Martinez stood quickly. "Objection." Ms. Johnson's social media activity is irrelevant to this hearing. I'm establishing potential bias, Bennett argued. I'll allow it, Judge Lawson said. The witness may answer. Letitia took a deep breath. Yes, I have discussed racial justice on my personal social media. As a black woman and an educator, these issues matter to me. Bennett smiled triumphantly. So you admit you have strong feelings about racial matters. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted Judge Harmon's comments through this lens of racial sensitivity? Letitia looked directly at Bennett, then at Judge Harmon, and finally at the packed courtroom. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about my interpretation. Judge Harmon stated clearly what he thought of me based on the color of my skin. Everyone heard it. The transcript recorded it. And the most telling evidence. She paused, her voice growing stronger. He's not even denying it. He hasn't once claimed he didn't say those things. Bennett had no response. As Letitia stepped down from the witness stand, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harmon finally looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. In his, Letitia saw something unexpected: defeat. 6 months after that fateful day in court, Letitia Johnson stood before a different kind of audience. The community center was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, gathered for the first public forum of the newly established Judicial Accountability Project. Thank you all for coming, Letitia began, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been half a year ago. When I walked into a courtroom to contest a simple traffic ticket, I never imagined it would lead to where we are today. The journey had been challenging but transformative. Following the preliminary hearing, the evidence against Judge Harmon had proven so overwhelming that he had accepted a plea deal rather than face a full trial. He had pleaded guilty to judicial misconduct, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. The man who once wielded absolute authority in his courtroom was now serving a 3-year sentence in the state penitentiary. But the case had exposed much more than one corrupt judge. The investigation had uncovered a network of officials who had enabled Harmon's behavior for years, from court clerks who buried complaints to police officers who deliberately targeted certain citizens for his courtroom. 7 officers had been suspended, and 2 senior court administrators had resigned in disgrace. This isn't just my story, Letitia continued, gesturing to the people seated behind her on the stage. This is their story too. Melissa Chen smiled nervously from her seat. The court reporter had become an unlikely hero in the case, her meticulous documentation providing crucial evidence. Next to her sat Officer Williams, who had risked his career by testifying against fellow law enforcement officers. The 3 elderly courthouse angels beamed with pride, their years of quiet observation finally validated. Together, we've created something important, Letitia said, holding up a tablet displaying the Judicial Accountability Project's website. A place where people can report judicial misconduct without fear, where trained volunteers observe courtrooms to ensure that justice is truly blind, where we educate citizens about their rights in court. The past 6 months had changed Letitia's life in ways she never expected. She still taught 3rd grade. Her students had greeted her return with handmade cards declaring her a superhero, but her evenings and weekends were now dedicated to the project. What had begun as one woman standing up for herself had grown into a movement for change. Judge Robert Harmon thought people like me didn't belong in his courtroom, Letitia said, her voice steady and clear. But courts don't belong to judges. They belong to the people. All people. The audience erupted in applause. From the back of the room, District Attorney Sarah Phillips watched with satisfaction. The case had initially created turmoil in the local justice system, but the reforms that followed had strengthened it. A diverse group of new judges had been appointed, including a black woman who now presided over Harmon's former courtroom. As Letitia concluded her remarks, a young woman approached the microphone during the question period. Ms. Johnson, weren't you afraid? Standing up to someone so powerful? Letitia considered the question carefully. I was terrified, she admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing means being afraid and moving forward anyway. After the forum ended, Renee Washington, who had become both Letitia's attorney and friend, handed her an envelope. It's official. The governor has approved your appointment to the State Judicial Ethics Commission, the first non-lawyer ever to serve. Letitia opened the envelope with trembling fingers. I never thought. That's exactly why you're perfect for it, Washington said. You saw the system from the outside. You felt its failures firsthand, and you had the courage to speak up. As they walked out of the community center together, a reporter approached for one final question. Ms. Johnson, looking back, would you do it all again? Knowing what it would cost you in terms of privacy and peace of mind. Letitia looked back at the community center, where people were still gathered in small groups, sharing their own courthouse stories. Some had already signed up as volunteer court observers. Others had registered for Know Your Rights training sessions. Justice isn't just about one case or one courtroom, she said thoughtfully. It's about changing systems that allow injustice to flourish. And that change always begins with one person willing to stand and say, "This is wrong." She smiled at the reporter. So yes, I would do it again. Every single time.